Some people think the only way to experience history is through books, but through preservation, we can live with those artifacts every day. My name is Richard Hess, and I'm an artisan craftsman. I first got started with the woodworking probably about 12 years old at home in our basement. Had a woodworking tool down there, a little wood lathe, and just started having fun on that and seeing what I could do with it. Pop's always had stuff in the garage. He was a hands-on kind of feller, not to like what I do, but always had table saws and tools, and helped me set up a one-car garage workshop at the home front there in city in Port Huron. Did stuff there for a few years just for hobby. Got into high school, and high school wasn't difficult, but it wasn't fun. Spent all my time down in wood shop, and that's where I kind of honed my craft down there. Did some pieces, actually got in some the shows that they put on for the high school students, and that did pretty good on that. And then we had a piece of property, built a little addition off a garage we had built, and moved my shop into a 20 by 25 space behind a block garage we had. That was my first real studio or real workshop. And then that's when I met a buddy of mine that does some stained glass work, and I have never had a real job. I've never had a steady paycheck, never had bennies, nothing like that. But yeah, started out a little bit in the garage at home, down to a second one. And this is actually my third shop I can say I've been into. Basically, people ask, what do you do? For the last 20, 30 years, I've been doing heirloom furniture restoration, specialty pieces. Some of them are one-of-a-kind pieces. I have done some stuff that, boy, if I'd had any idea what I was going to get myself into when I was a young pup, I never would have believed it, I have done some of the top-of-the-heap stuff. Got a lot of knowledge with all the years I've been doing this, things I have learned. Self-taught, never went to other than high school, learned a few things that way. Pretty much self-taught, hard knocks for the most part, but working on some fine pieces that teach you how to do it. And a lot of happy customers, and they just keep coming back. When I was a young pup getting into the woodworking, my grandfather, I found out, was a very handy fella. He was wrenched on stuff. He did everything back in pre-Depression days. I have some of his tools that I still use, and they're the old hand tools. And with the type of work I do, that's also another thing. I don't do a volume of things. Fixing an old piece of furniture, you're only making one of those pieces. It tends to be a high-quality furniture-grade lumber. It cuts very nice with the hand tools, hand plane, chisels, things like that. So I don't need the power tools. Power tools are noisy, they're dusty, they're dangerous. I'm still all here, trying to keep it that way. That's probably one of my biggest gripes, is just the noise and the dust. And I do such a low volume of things, I don't need the power tools. When you run a piece of wood through a machine, you don't look at the wood being cut. You stand back and let the chips fly. When you put that piece of wood in the vise and you run your hand plane across it, you read the grain, you see it come out. It's absolutely gorgeous, some of it. And I get particular fixing some of these old pieces of furniture. Dog chewed the leg off it, and it's a 1800s whatever. Trying to find the piece of wood that fits that piece of furniture spot. Reading the grain, whether it's rift sawn, quarter flat, whatever. Trying to line those things up, and that's really hard to do on a power tool. But by hand, it's not so difficult. It takes time. Old growth lumber is something that we don't have anymore. Old growth lumber is when it was in the woods fighting for daylight. You'd hear stories about how tall the trees were. Hundreds of feet tall, thick woods, the sun didn't even get down to the floor. Those type of trees grow tall, but they don't grow large around. So every year they put on a ring, And on those type of trees, the old growth lumber, the rings are so close together that when you cut them into boards, it puts a whole different look to it. The stability of it, the way the grain comes out, the flaking in some of it, irreplaceable. You can't get that. That's one of the reasons I save salvage pieces. You know, I can see a piece that's valuable for down the road. That's probably one of the hardest things to replace on this old pieces. Over the years, taking furniture apart, some of it, you can't save the piece, so you save some pieces off of it. I will cut into those pieces, and they're vintage from the same years and era that what I'm working on is from. So the trees came from the same timing, the age to them. I've got a corner in my back room of salvage pieces, but to find it when you want it, you never do. So if you don't already have it, boy, it's tough. Learning how to carve goes right along with restoring the furniture. To put a piece back onto the piece, you have to do what the first craftsman did. Not always the simplest, but if you look at what they did, it becomes obvious after you do it a couple of times. You never get it right the first time, until you get proficient at it. Actually, my first carvings that I've done are still hanging in my office on a coat rack I did. Again, super simple. It was out of a salvaged piece of wood from like an armoire type piece. Anyhow, salvaged piece of oak out of that, cut it out with the bandsaw, and did. At this point, it's a super crude piece, but that was one of my first carvings, and I've still got it to this day, which shows me how far I've come. How I really got into the carving and got good at it, I got working with a friend of mine to replace an altar that had burnt in Greektown, St. Mary's, and he got the job on it. Good friend went over there and helped him on that, and then we were not carvers, but this thing was elaborately carved. Found a guy that knew how to carve, got him to come up and work with him, and he was something else. And then he came up, and I spent a summer with him carving, and that's priceless. You can't buy that. These tools are not razor sharp. They are surgically sharp. But he would strop them up, get them sharp, and he would actually take the skin, and he would be able to shave the skin. And not just shave the hair, but shave the skin. So they're surgically sharp tools, and which is what you need to do a good carving job. And you only cut yourself when you pick up a tool. But yeah, they are surgically sharp tools. But carving, he taught me that there's 3 times over to do a piece of carving. First off, you have the line work, so you know what you're carving. You got to have some lines to go by. You got to know what you're carving. You don't just pull this out of thin air. You go over it once and you place everything. Like if you're doing a flower, where the center is, where the petals are, where the stem is going to be, and you just get a general concept of what it's going to be when you get done. So that's roughing it in, and then you go over it again, and then you actually carve it. Now you can move everything around. You always leave extra, so now you move the petals and everything around till you get it exactly where you want it, and you carve it to look like what you want. You always leave a little bit extra, because now you go over it and you clean it, and you don't sand carving. You go over it with this sharp chisel, and when you do that final cleanup, you get that curvature, you get the sheen of it, you don't see any of the marks, and it is a finished piece at that point. But it's 3 times over, and he was right. It really does work that way. Matching finishes is one of and that's a final thing you do after you do the repairs. Partly is identifying what they did in the first place. Most of the stuff is so old that a lot of it's been kind of worn off. I have come into a huge problem on trying to put a varnish on my pieces anymore. The varnish I used to use, they no longer make. Talk about a stumbling block. But a lot of it I get into, I've got some oils I use. I stain pieces. There is no stain that comes straight out of a can that is the color I want. Almost any piece I stain to match something, there's 2 or 3 layers of staining to it. Put it on, wipe it off. There's an order you put it on also. What goes underneath, what goes on top, which one do you wipe off, which one do you let dry. That has just been trial and error over the years. You look in my cabinet there and I've got dozens of cans of colors. What do you need so many for? You know, you don't need them often, but when you need it, you need it. So it's a tough one. Putting the final coats on it, you have to make it up as you go, because there is no book that tells you what to do. And again, it's a trial and error to get that finish. Antique pieces are never shiny, so it turns into a lot of elbow grease, a lot of handwork to rub them, different ways of rubbing, a cloth to steel wool to a scuffy pad to sandpaper to whatever, and just multiple layers. It's layer upon layer to get these, the finish, to get the color you want, because it's something that's years and years old. It's been handled a lot too, so you don't want it to look too fresh. You want to, luckily the old pieces, you can be a little bit rough with them, because that whole piece of furniture has had a rough life in its whole life. So you can let a few marks show up on it. It should have those in it. Whenever I'm taking a piece of furniture apart to do the restoration on it, I'm touching something somebody else did. Back in the day, I'm assuming it was another man, but you never know. But when I get into repairing a piece of an heirloom piece of furniture, the tooling marks on it, I can tell the type of tool he used. One of the biggest things I get is a client will bring in a piece. One of the first things is, how old do you think this is? You know, can you tell me about it? It's like, well, when I get done with this, I can tell you about it, but right now I'm not real sure. I disassemble these pieces back down to each piece. All the joints come apart, because usually every 100 years the glue has failed. So every 100-year-old piece tends to need re-gluing. The old glues or the hide glues, they did well for their time, but life expectancy on them tends to be about 100 years. So I tear these all apart. I have learned to get them apart, you have to be very careful. You have to finesse them apart. I actually use a mallet and will pop the joints apart that way. You can booger stuff up real good that way, but it works. But you have to be very careful finessing them apart. Don't do any damage, don't do any harm. Take them apart, clean them, and when I do that, I can look into the dowel holes. I can tell you whether they used a brace and bit and an auger bit, or whether they used a brad point bit, whether this was hand planed. I will get dressers in here that they're 1800s or so. Most of the stuff was run through power tools back in the 1800s, mill marks they call them, little cutter marks you can still see on them. Some of these old dressers I get in here, if you feel the bottoms of the drawers, you run your hand across the bottom of the drawer and you'll feel little ripples in there. And like, what in the heck caused that? Back in the day, they didn't have all these planers. So not all the shops had these planers. They had big hand planes, and the hand planes would have a small scoop to them. And they would chuck that up on the bench, and they would actually take the saw blade marks off it with this tool, hand plane. They would actually hand plane these pieces of wood down to get the thickness they want, and those would go in the drawer slides. You know, you felt it on the bottom. One thing I've learned about a lot of this woodworking is if you don't see it, it doesn't exist. You know, if you don't see it and the client doesn't see it, it's on the back side, it's on the bottom side. You don't put your effort into fine-tuning what you don't see. You put all your effort into what you do see. To take a 200-year-old piece of furniture, to put a piece of wood onto that and make it look like it's an original piece of wood on that, that's kind of an art in itself. I did a cradle for a client one time back in the day, a little swinging baby's cradle, cherry cradle, almost 200 years old at the time, Jenny Lind style. The side had been destroyed, side and part of the end was bad. Made all the spindles, made the rails, put it all back together. Had just came up with a process for aging cherry. So within about 3 days, I was able to create 200-year-old looking cherry wood. Darkened it all up, put it all back together. It looked fabulous. Only thing about it that I wasn't happy with, I did not beat that new pieces of wood up enough to make it look old enough. You know, other than that, I had it, but there's always one little thing. But yeah, I was able to make 200-year-old cherry in just a matter of days. Reading a book, that was some of my fine woodworking books. Once you start dealing with these old pieces, you know, I've had 200-year-old pieces in here I've worked on. I've worked on church pieces, sculptures, statues, altars, top of the heap kind of things that I would have never imagined I'd even be touching. You get into these and it needs a certain something to it, a veneer, a carving, a leg, something, I don't want to say extravagant, but unusual. And I look around and there's nobody more qualified than me to do it. So I guess it's up to me to do it. So then you dig into it, and man did it once, man can do it again. It is doable. It takes time, and you got to think about it. You don't get a second chance to mess it up. You get into somebody's, I don't necessarily want to say a priceless heirloom antique, but you get into something that's very special, and you have to be careful with it. Taking things apart, you don't dare mess it up. You don't make it worse, because anything you make worse you have to fix. And that's probably how I got to be a good repairman, is I broke things trying to fix things. And you have to fix it. That's not why it came in, because that piece was broken. You have to fix that, and the customer can't know that it was ever broken, and you don't get paid for doing that either. So you learn to tighten up a little bit and don't make mistakes. I have gotten into specializing in the restoration of heirloom pieces. I'm like most of my clients as well. I've got something that means something to me, and I don't care what it takes. I need somebody to do this. I need somebody to do it right, figure out how to pay for it, you know, but I want it done. I want it done well. Again, the best thing about what I'm doing is I've been doing it long enough that I've got enough reputation and references that people come to me and here I can do it. And you got to have their confidence. Nobody's going to turn over their 100-and-some-year-old piece that when they were a child they had it and they want it fixed right, because I've gotten pieces that have come into here right from another shop that did the restoration on it. They came right from that shop to my shop with it. Can you fix it now? Look at what they did. This isn't what I asked for, you know, so I'll do that. But what I really like about the fixing the old heirloom pieces is the stories that come in with it. I've got a piece right behind you there. A friend of mine, she was telling me that when she was a child, she used to use the bottom for a corral for her horses. She'd lay on the floor and put her critters in there, and that was her corral. And the stories, you know, now it brings it to life. And that was her mama's. Things like that. Brought a woman to tears in here one time. Came in, brought a 1800s walnut dresser. Somebody had tried to fix it, kind of boogered it up. It came in here. It took me probably close to a year to fix it. Marble tops, tilt mirror, all ornate. Had it up in the front. She came in to pick it up. Literally cried. And then I hear the story that when she was a little girl, that was in the bedroom of her grandmother's house where she slept. And she would wake up every day and see that. So, I mean, that's priceless.